Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Turning Point, How Pandemics Helped Conquer Mexico 500 years ago with Prof. David Carrasco. I have just a couple of housekeeping notes as we get underway. Feel free to use the chat box to say hello from wherever you are in the world, and use the Q&A box for any questions that you wish to pose during today's recorded presentation. We will leave ample time later in the hour to answer as many of your questions as possible. My name is Jill Felicio, and I am a member of Harvard's classes of 2000 and 2013, as well as the Director of Advancement for the Division of Continuing Education. I am delighted to welcome you tonight for this very eye-opening presentation. In my role at Harvard, I am privileged to work with the Harvard Extension Alumni Association Board of Directors and hundreds of dedicated volunteer leaders from around the world to create professional, social, and learning opportunities for our 30,000 plus global community members. In fact, tonight's event was conceived by our exceptional alumni leadership of the Harvard Extension Alumni Association's Midwest chapter. Thank you, Sol, Elizabeth, and Tim for this fabulous idea. Now, this event is one in a series of virtual events that we are running throughout the year to bring you topics that are timely, urgent, and hopefully enriching for you both personally and professionally. Now, Professor Carrasco is the Neil L. Rudenstein Professor of the Study of Latin America at Harvard Divinity School, with a joint appointment with the Department of Anthropology and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He is a renowned Mexican-American historian of religions with particular interest in Mesoamerican cities as symbols and the Mexican-American borderlands. His studies with historians of religions at the University of Chicago inspired him to work on the question, where is your sacred space? And on the challenges of post-colonial ethnography and theory, and on the practices and symbolic nature of ritual violence and comparative perspective. Prof. won Harvard Extension School's Petra Shattuck Excellence in Teaching Award in 2011. He was awarded the Mexican Order of the Aztec Eagle in 2004, the highest recognition which Mexico gives to foreign nationals for their contributions to the understanding of Mexican culture and history. His teaching career at Harvard has included significant team taught courses with anthropologists Arthur Kleinman, William Fash, and Michael D. Jackson, and linguist Maria Luisa Parra. You may have seen him participate in spirited debates with Cornel West and Samuel Huntington on the topics of race, culture, and religion in the Americas. David was also a dear friend and colleague of Nobel laureate author Toni Morrison, and appears in the 2019 acclaimed documentary, Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am. He has so many amazing stories of their travels together and wrote a beautiful eulogy after her passing in 2019 that I highly encourage you to check out. So it's my pleasure and distinct honor to welcome Prof. David Carrasco.
So thank you very much, Jill. That's a great opportunity for me to be able to work with you, Sol, my former student Elizabeth, and Tim, spend time with Harvard alums to talk about a very interesting, very powerful topic about pandemics in Mexico, and especially the role of pandemics and in this great event, which we call the conquest of Mexico. So let me go ahead and begin by bringing up my PowerPoint that I've been working on. Make sure I've got the right one here. Hold on, let me see here. I think this is the right one, yeah. So basically, tonight's presentation is going to be a series of stories that I'm going to tell you about what I call the turning point, how pandemics helped conquer Mexico 500 years ago. And you see two notions of conquest, two notions of damage being done in Mexico in the 16th century, which is going to be the focus of my talk. Here you see a recreation of the great battle for the capital of Tenochtitlan in 1521. So we're talking about just 500 years ago this year is when this great transformation took place in what is now called Mexico City. But on the right, you'll see a painting that came from a marvelous collection of interviews and writings that were produced between 1530 and 1580 in Mexico City, a fundamental document for understanding pre-Hispanic and early colonial Mexico called the Florentine Codex. And in book 12 of the Florentine Codex, we find this painting, which shows indigenous people during the actual war for the city being struck down by smallpox or perhaps measles. We're not totally sure what this very powerful epidemic was, but we see people who've been struck with this. If you can see my cursor, here's a woman who is actually praying. This indicates that she's praying. And here we see the nurse who is actually singing to this individual who is suffering from a disease that was brought to Mexico by the Europeans. So we see war, but we also see disease as two very important social processes that in a sense transformed Mexico. You know, my good colleague here at Harvard, Stephen Greenblatt, wrote a wonderful book called The Swerve. And it's about really, in a sense, the way the Renaissance was in part generated from the discovery of an ancient book. And this ancient book by Lucretius on the nature of things presented another worldview to that part of Europe at the time. And this new worldview he says what it did is it brought about a swerve in history, that history's direction actually changed. And in his book, The Swerve, Greenblatt says, think about other events, whether they were overt or covert, that had such impact on history that it actually changed the direction of history, not only for a short period of time, but for a very long period of time. And that's what we're talking about today, because in the history of the so-called Americas, tell me what's a greater event that has taken place, that has shaped the Americas, than the so-called conquest of Mexico, or what we now call the Gran Encuentro, the great encounter between Iberians, by indigenous people, and eventually by Africans who came to Mexico, and also Asians. So this is the kind of thinking that I've put together into this for this talk tonight on the turning point, how pandemics helped conquer Mexico 500 years ago. Now, this thinking, this work that I'm doing and sharing with you tonight really comes from a course that my good colleague, William Fash, and I teach at Harvard. We've been teaching this for a number of years. We've had everything from 250 students to 80 students in this class. It's a part of the general education program. It's called Moctezuma's Mexico, Then and Now. And the most recent version of this class was called The Past, the Present, Pandemics and Protests in North America. And what you're seeing there is one of the great paintings by Diego Rivera, the great Mexican muralist. And he's painted for us Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, as it was imagined by Rivera, who had access to some of the eyewitness accounts of the city. And I'm going to take you into this city to tell you the story of the war for the city and the role of these diseases, and how they, in a sense, were actually a turning point in the battle between Aztecs, or Mexicas, as they were called themselves, and the Spaniards. So my talk is going to be in a number of parts. First of all, I'm going to tell you my story and what I call Aztec moment, my Aztec moment, to introduce myself to you, so you can understand kind of what's at stake for me in talking about this, and why I want to share this with you. Then I want to talk to you about the rise of the Aztec Mexica Empire, so you can have some background for the war that took place there, and also the role of these epidemics that came. I'll take you briefly through 10 key events of the wars for the Aztec capital. So you can get a sense of what led up to the outbreak of this pandemic that really destroyed or nearly destroyed the Aztec elites. And I want to talk about what I call plague century, because the 16th century in Mesoamerica, it was a century of repeated epidemics, repeated plagues that, even the most conservative demographers say between 70 and 90% of the indigenous population was died in the first 100 years, not only from abuse, but also from a series of very powerful epidemics that reduced the population, in ways that we find mind-boggling. We're talking about what percentage of people who are getting COVID are taken from us. It's a very small percentage. It's devastating for those families that lose people, but it's a very small percentage. Think about what would happen if 80% of the population of the United States, or 80% of the population of Massachusetts, was to be taken away in a generation from variations of the epidemic. So we're talking about something that took place in the 16th century in Mexico that is on a scale that's very hard for us to imagine. I want to talk about that. And I want to talk also about something that is on my mind, and what I call the racist plague of the 16th century, and how that racist plague of the 16th century influences us today, even in the contemporary political situation in this country. And then I want to end on something more upbeat, which is what I call the Day of the Dead in Mexico today, share with you the way in which Mexicans today face up to this history in ways I think that are healing and very creative. So I want to start with my story and Aztec moment by showing you, first of all, the picture of the border, El Paso, Texas. You're looking actually at the American Smelting and Refining Company with Mexico there in the background in El Paso. And this was, for a long time in this country, this had the largest industrial smokestack in the world. And my family really comes from this desert. My father's family comes from this area. You can see the Smelting and Refining Company. My grandfather, Miguel, built a school on this, at this company for Mexicans who came across the border, who were growing up in the borderlands. And it was a school to teach them the trades so that they could learn how to work effectively, to raise their families. But in my grandfather's case, Miguel Carrasco, his school, called the Smelter Vocational School, was designed to help these young Mexicans, both male and female, become better citizens. The idea was that their education, by learning the trades at this school, would also prepare them to be good citizens. And the idea here in my grandfather's case was a kind of social justice. It was that education was a form of social justice to give people who really wanted to participate fully in the US democracy and culture tools to do that. And this was kind of the background for my own education. This was how I was raised to think about education, that it should not only be about learning beauty and complexity and science and technological innovation, but it should also be an education that improved the society and became more inclusive in a very fair-minded way. So this is where my story begins. And here you see my grandparents. This is my grandmother, Carlota. She was born in the Copper Canyon in Mexico. It's my grandfather, Miguel. And they raised me for a while as a child. And my grandmother was she was the matriarch of the family on both sides of the border. She had her sense of humor. She had wisdom. And she had this beautiful skin. You can see her there. She was muy prieta, as we say. very dark skin, coming from Tarahumara country. And, my grandmother, we always loved to be around her. And I remember one day we asked her, how come you have such beautiful skin? And she says, well, I have a secret ingredient. And so that fascinated us as children. We said, well, what's the secret ingredient? She says, come over here and I'll whisper it to you. And we said, well, she said, well, my secret ingredient is prayer, 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 and good cosmetics, she said. And so this taught me something growing up about, first of all, a sense of respect and interest in something greater than humans, something that you had to reach out to depend on, to know, to respect. And there are many forms of prayer, and I learned them as a child. But that good cosmetics also came to mean something to me later. Cosmetics, not just the idea of, making your face look, but it was about cosmology. It was about understanding the organization of design of cultures and the way they could redesign themselves. So this background, in a sense, set me up to become the scholar and person I am. My father, Davíd Carrasco, was a boxer, a great basketball coach, a great basketball player. And as a matter of fact, he inherited his own father's approach to education. It's going to be hard for some of you to believe this, but we moved to Washington, D.C. And in 1955, my father became the first Mexican-American to be a head basketball coach at a major university in this country. And at that time, if you can believe it, Georgetown, George Washington, University of Maryland, all of those schools only allowed white people to play in college sports until my father got there. And my father was the first coach in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area to recruit African-Americans and put together an integrated team. There was a brown coach, black players, white players. And I grew up, I was about 10 years old. I grew up in this environment. I saw this happen. I saw them play teams where we had to fight our ways out of some gymnasiums. I saw a tremendous amount of public racism against the coach and the team, but the team stuck together. And I saw that this was a case where a Mexican-American was somebody who took the lead in racial justice and saw athletics, and not just about playing, but it was about the playing field and making the playing field as level as we could. And here you see his team. And this is the night they beat Georgetown by 30 points. And Georgetown, is considered one of the great colleges in the country. And they were all white for another 10 years after my father did this. And here you see them. So I'm just trying to give you a background of why I study and teach the way I do, and some of the values that are important to me. This is my father when he was a basketball player in Mexico. That's him in the middle there. He played with the national Mexican team. And after he became a coach in Washington, D.C., he was constantly invited back to Mexico to train Mexican coaches for the Olympic Games in 1968. And here you see him with these coaches. I like this very much because you see the closeness of them. You see the affection that they have. You see that they're enjoying their learning. And so this is kind of the background. This is a mural of my father's life in El Paso. This is the El Paso Job Corps Center, now called the Davíd Carrasco Job Corps Center. That's my 96-year-old mother in front there. And so there you get a sense of, in a sense, where I'm coming from. My mother's an artist, and she's still alive there. And hopefully we'll make it to her 97th year, which will be on May the 3rd. So this is kind of the background. And when I was 13 years old, my father took me to Mexico City. My parents took me to Mexico City. I had my Aztec moment. And this is the great Zocalo of Mexico City. This is the presidential palace. If you can see my cursor, the National Cathedral, the great Zocalo of Mexico, kind of a combination of the way Aztecs organized space and the way the Spaniards organized space. And when I was 13, I went there, and my tia Milena Sofaro took me to the museum, the Museum of Anthropology, which at that time was right down this street here, the Moneda Street. And when I was there, I had what I call my Aztec moment. Not a senior moment where I am forgetting something, but this was a teenager's Aztec moment where I came to understand something more about my roots, my complexity. And what happened was I went into the museum and I saw things like this. I saw the Aztec calendar stone. I saw pictorial manuscripts. I saw Maya jade. I saw masks made by these people. And it absolutely shook me up because, growing up around Washington, D.C. as a Mexican American, Hey man, everywhere you went, they told you, well, civilization, that's the Greeks, that's the Romans, the Egyptians, because we see them in movies. But Mexico, that wasn't the place of civilization. That wasn't the place of great thinking and complex technology and profound philosophies. But on this day, when I was there as a teenager, I felt shook up by this. And what came to the surface was kind of a shame at being Mexican, because I'd been told that, well, civilization was elsewhere. But at the same time, something pushed back against that. And I felt, no, wait a second, there's something here to be known, to be understood. I can feel pride in this. I'm not white, I'm not black, I'm something, a combination that's still to be understood and discovered. I feel that sometimes still at Harvard, it's still to be understood and discovered. And so I remember going out into the Zocalo and walking around afterward and being shook up and feeling this conflict, both a shame, but also a kind of a pride and a curiosity. And I felt that, this civilization is also worthy of my attention. And subsequent excavations that I've been a part of have uncovered what was beneath that very site. And I'm going to be taking you into that today so that you can understand what this civilization was like that was broken by the Iberians, their indigenous allies, and also by the pandemic that hit this Aztec city in 1521. So with that background, let me tell you about the rise of the Mexica Empire, what was called the Triple Alliance, so that you can understand what really was at stake, why the Spaniards were absolutely fascinated and felt the combination of love, greed, and great aggression toward the Aztecs. So this is a front piece of a document that was painted in the 1540s by indigenous painters who were preparing this under Spanish control for the King of Spain. So he could see the new world that by 1540s people in Europe knew about this. And this was a book that was being presented, never made it to Spain. The French got it on the high seas, some pirates got it, and it ended up in Paris. But it's today in the Bodleian Library in England. So what are you looking at here? Well, you're looking at the Lake of Mexico. That's what these blue lines mean. You're looking at the moment the Aztecs arrive in the city of Mexico. There were migrants coming from the north. There's the great image that's on the Mexican flag, the great eagle landing on a blooming cactus. Here you see the 10 leaders of the city. This is a calendar. Whenever you look at these documents, by the way, you always want to look, first of all, at their time signs. Well, there's 51 time signs. Each of these boxes represents 1 year in the Aztec calendar. And so you look for time, you look for space. Well, here's the spatial notion. Somehow the painter says whatever was in the middle of the lake, and it was a city, was divided into 4 parts. So they're telling you something about the spatial action. There's some action going on here as well. Spatial order, there's some action. Notice this character here, he's a little different. He's larger, he's darker, and he's got this little blue thing in front of him. That's a speech glyph. He's the chief speaker, he's the king. He's the ruler. And so he's telling a story about this foundation. The other action that you had to know about is down here outside of the city. So this is the city, inside of these blue lines. Out here is warfare. The Aztec warriors are conquering 2 towns, and they were conquistadors themselves. And here you see in the darker brown color there, that's the Aztec Empire in 1520, when the Spaniards came. They controlled all of this territory. And I want you to notice, because we're going to come back to this, that right here, this area right here, where it's a lighter color, that's an area they couldn't conquer. And that group, the Tlaxcalans, they became absolutely crucial on the Spanish side. As a matter of fact, I don't know why people have never been able to internalize this fact. 80% of the army that Cortez led were indigenous warriors from Tlaxcala and other areas. It wasn't so much a conquest as it was a rebellion by city-states who had been at war with the Aztecs for a long time. Now, how did this expansion take place? So you can understand it. So one of the ways that Aztecs built this empire was through warfare. So I've already told you in the earlier slide that these blocks over here represent years. So this is telling you that these are the years in which this ruler, you can see he's got that blue glyph in front of him. He's also got a blue diadem. He's also sitting on a woven mat that is dried out. That means he's the chief speaker, he's the ruler. And here's a symbol for his army, his city. During these years, he was a ruler and they defeated all these towns or cities. So this shows you the growth of the empire when this ruler was able to conquer these towns. Here's another one. This is a different king, subsequent king during these years. He conquered these towns, but most important to understand the power of the Aztecs is this image right here, this glyph. This is a pyramid. This on fire, which means that it's been conquered by the Aztecs. He has conquered this town, and they threw the ruler of that town off the pyramid. And this is telling us this story in a book painted in 1540, 20 years after the Aztec Empire fell, for the King of Spain. So you see that they wanted this town. Why did they want this town? This was the great marketplace. And during the year of this king, the Aztecs were able to incorporate not only these other towns, which were paying them tribute, they got control of the great marketplace. And I'm going to show you that marketplace in a minute. So it was an empire by tribute payments. And here you see in another page from the Codex Mendoza, this 1542 document, each of these images over here, each of these glyphs represents a town controlled by the Aztec Moctezuma. Here's Moctezuma being carried through the marketplace, and over here are a list of images. These are images of the things these towns had to pay to the Aztec capital in order to keep peace with them. So you have these wonderful warrior uniforms. You have foodstuffs. You have these blankets. And there's page after page in the Codex Mendoza showing how this Aztec capital grew under this both military and marketplace tributary empire. Here's the first Moctezuma. You know, there were two Moctezumas, the Moctezuma that greeted Cortez, and then one of his uncles, or maybe his grandfather, I can't remember, who ruled from 1440 to 1469. And here he is. And here's his name. His name, Moctezuma, means angry lord. Angry lord. And here you see an arrow piercing the sky. He was called Archer of the Sky. And during his longer reign, you can see that he was able to conquer many towns. As a matter of fact, there's another page with all of his conquests. So here you see this notion of the world before the Spaniards come, a great city, a very rich city, a city that, in a sense, really blew the Spaniards' minds, and you'll see that in a minute, and very many powerful warrior groups. These are 4 different warrior groups. Each warrior has a different costume, has a different shield, according to their success on the battlefield. So you know how you see these generals now, they got all their emblems here and showing all this. Well, the same thing here. So this is how this empire really grew. So here you see each of these colors represents one of the rulers. And so the Aztecs, they expanded from the center here. The next ruler came in and got all this area. Another ruler got in and all these, where you have these lines and so forth. So you have this triple alliance. That's a triple alliance because it's Tenochtitlan, that's the Aztec capital, Tlatelolco, the marketplace, and a third town, Tacuba, which also provided things that this alliance needed in order to control not only these different territories, but also manage the tributary payments that came into the capital. And so this is the world that grew from about 1325. The Aztec capital really takes off in about 1420 up until 1520, just a year after the Spaniards have arrived. Now let me take you through 10 key events of the wars for the Aztec Empire so that you can understand what was going on between the Spaniards, their large numbers of indigenous allies, and the Mexica, the Aztecs themselves. So the first thing that you have to know, the first thing that happens that shapes this great encounter is Cortez arrives from Cuba in 1519. There have been two previous expeditions that came in 1517 and 1518 from Cuba, and both of these expeditions they got beat up by indigenous warriors, but they made it back to Cuba and said, hey, we've learned that there's something very complicated, very rich, and very powerful that we haven't seen here in the Caribbean islands. So let's put together a much more significant, well-prepared expedition. And Cortez is the leader of this expedition in 1519. And the first thing they do is they arrive down here on Cozumel. Perhaps some of you have been to Cozumel for vacation. I've been there. And when they get to Cozumel in 1519, they start to hear a little Spanish spoken. And they think, hey, maybe some Spaniards were here. They start checking around. And in fact, they find out that there's two Spaniards who have now been integrated into Maya society. And one of them is named Aguilar. And Aguilar was a priest, a Spanish priest who had been shipwrecked. He'd been living in the Caribbean, he'd been shipwrecked. And while a number of his companions have been killed, he has become basically a laborer in Maya society. Here you see a recreation of his encounter with Cortez. Cortez finds him. A number of Mayas come to meet Cortez. He doesn't even recognize the Spaniard because he now looks very indigenous. But the value of Aguilar is that he speaks Maya now, and he also speaks Spanish. So he becomes the first part in the linguistic bridge that allows the Spaniards to understand kind of where they are and what's going on. Now they're in Maya territory, they're not in Aztec territory. And Aguilar tells him, hey, listen, there's another one of us, but I don't think he's coming back. Aguilar comes back and joins the Spaniards, and he said, why not? Well, he's a war chief. And in fact, the other Spaniard who's represented here, Gonzalo Guerrero, is a Maya war chief at this point. Not only that, he has a family. He's married a Maya woman, and they have children. And he's a tough guy. And he's considered one of the leaders of a Maya warrior outfit. As a matter of fact, it appears that he fights against the Spaniards eventually. Cortez is really upset that this guy won't come back and join them. So there's already this Spanish presence there, and Aguilar becomes absolutely crucial until they move up the coast. And what they find is that people up there are speaking a different language. But this is the second great thing that happens for the Spaniards. It was the custom of indigenous people when they wanted to form alliances with you to give women, to exchange women, young women, so that families would be formed who would share the two groups' interests and lineages. And indigenous women are given to the Spaniards. And among these women is not only a beautiful young woman, but a woman who speaks not only the Maya language that Aguilar can speak, but she speaks Nahuatl. She speaks the lingua franca of the Aztec Empire. And she now becomes Cortez's right-hand woman, becomes his companion, eventually bears him a child. And she becomes so close to him that if you see in this particular painting, look how close they are. And all the paintings, they're very close. She becomes an extension of Cortez, and she's here translating for the royalty of another community that speaks the Aztec language. And that community is providing these young women as gifts to the Spaniards as a way of trying to form alliances. Now, what happens is that here's the route of Cortez. By the time months later they get all the way to the Aztec capital, here you see the passageway, they've been given 400 women. And these women are cooking, they're now having sexual relations with these Spaniards. They're translating for the Spaniards, and some of them are learning, of course, the Spanish language. But the woman who is most crucial is this woman who becomes known as La Malinche. And she's with Cortez all the way through. And here you see where different groups of women who are given. And you'll notice that the largest group takes place here in Tlaxcala. That's the place that the Aztecs could never conquer. And I'm going to show you in a minute why that's such an important location. So the Spaniards make their way up the coast with these translators. They fight a number of battles. They win some they don't win, but they keep moving. And along the way, they begin to form alliances with some of the indigenous warrior groups. And the army grows and grows so that you have other indigenous warriors who are now outnumbering the Spaniards in this army led by Cortes. And everything is going in Cortes's favor for the most part until they get to Tlaxcala. Because the Tlaxcalans are tough. And they're the ones who have fought off the Aztecs for generations. They've got great warriors. They've got their own market system. They've got their own aesthetic tradition. And the Spaniards can't beat them. And after a number of really tough battles, the Spaniards and the Tlaxcalans form an alliance. And they form this alliance because they come to understand that their enemy is over there in the lakes, that the Aztecs are their enemy. Remember, Tlaxcala was a region that the Aztecs never conquered. And here you see this alliance being formed. Here's the ruler of the Tlaxcalans. There's Malinche, the translator, very close to Cortes. There's Cortes pointing his finger, giving orders. He's giving some orders back. You can see some of the battle down here. But now they become the army. And the great majority from here on in are these indigenous warriors. I don't mean by a few, I mean like 80% of this army. And here you see that these people end up supplying the Spaniards. They end up supplying them with foodstuffs. They feed the horses. Indigenous people, they love these horses. They've never seen these horses. They thought these horses were the coolest things. And so now the Cortes Tlaxcalan army, they're very powerful, and they make their way toward Mexico City, toward Tenochtitlan, which is over here in the lakes, but they have to go through Cholula. Now, Cholula, they're not friends with the Tlaxcalans. They're rivals of the Tlaxcalans. And they have a big city, a very powerful, beautiful city. Maybe some of you have been to Cholula because the ruins are still there. And they come into Cholula, and according to the Spanish version of this, while they're camped in Cholula trying to develop an alliance with Cholula, they hear through Malinche, there she is, they hear through her, who has overheard from some elder women, that in fact the Cholulans are laying a surprise attack against the Spaniards and the Tlaxcaltecans, who've always been their enemy. And when the Spaniards and the Tlaxcaltecans hear this, they do a preemptive strike and they destroy the Cholulans. And then this becomes known as the Massacre of Cholula. And if in Mexico today, many people know about this massacre because it was such a devastating killing of not only warriors, but women and children. And the Spaniards, therefore, are known for this cruelty in Mexico today in terms of what happened at Cholula. And this multi-ethnic army, then number 5, they arrive in Tenochtitlan. And when they arrive in Tenochtitlan, they are so blown away by the city itself, which is in the lakes. And it's a garden city. There's this tremendous amount of agriculture that's being done in the lakes. And here you see a recreation of the arrival of the Spanish Tlaxcalan army coming up from the area of Coyoacan into the great ceremonial center with its pyramids. Here are the volcanoes in the background, Popo and Ixta seawater. So it's just multi-ethnic army comes into the, and then here's another interesting recreation of this meeting between Cuauhtemoc, between Moctezuma II, who you see here, and you notice that there's a distance between them because this distance was very important for the Aztecs to keep. And you see Moctezuma over here under this canopy. He's always got other elite warriors and royalty around him. And here's Cortes coming with Malinche, who speaks the language of the royal household. You see the horses in the background. This is one of those meetings that's considered, world changing. One of the accounts of this is by one of the soldiers in Cortez's army, named Bernal Diaz del Castillo. He wrote many years later his account of being part of this campaign, having been a part of all three of the Spanish expeditions to Mexico. And he's written this incredible book called The True History of the Conquest of New Spain. I did an abridgment of it. If you want to get to the Spanish side of this story, it's there. One of the values of the Spanish side, however, for all the other exaggerations and so forth, is that it's eyewitness in many cases. And you know what happens when an outsider comes into a place, they see things and describe things that sometimes the insiders wouldn't describe it that way. So we have these kind of almost sometimes journalistic accounts. This is what we saw. This is how high it was. How many people were there? This is how they dressed and so forth. But another book, if you want to go forward into this, that presents the Aztec side, is this incredible, wonderful book by great Mexican historian Miguel León Portilla. It's called The Broken Spears. And it's the Aztec account of the same, because after the conquest, when the Roman script was being written down by natives and mestizos and others, a number of indigenous people came and talked and told their experiences. And so you have two very different, sometimes competing views of what happened, and it's worth it. But this is something to show you why this epidemic that was soon to come was so devastating. Here's what Bernal Diaz del Castillo says when he's talking about it. He says, during the morning, we arrived at a broad causeway. When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water, and other great towns on dry land, that straight and level highway going toward Mexico, we were amazed. Said it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and queues, that means pyramids, and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. We didn't have masonry buildings in the Caribbean. And some of our soldiers asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. I do not know how to describe it, seeing things as we did that had never been heard of or seen before, not even dreamed about, So here's a recreation of what that city is. The Spaniards, let me get myself oriented here. They would have come up this causeway here into the city. It was a garden city in the middle of the lake. The Aztec population was not only here, but in many of these settlements around the lake. So it was this beautiful place, which was the center of this empire that I told you about. Here's another view of it. Here's the great ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan. And here's that marketplace over here. Here's the marketplace. So now the island itself not only had the great religious kind of the papacy, this is kind of St. Peter's, but they also had control of this great marketplace, which according to the Spaniards, 60,000 people a day were in that marketplace. They could hear the noise, a mile away coming from the marketplace. This is the world of the Spaniards. What happens then is that the Spaniards have occupied the city for some months now. They take Moctezuma kind of house prisoner, and they're starting to sort of persuade the Aztecs to accept it in some ways. When suddenly the news comes to Cortez, who's in the capital, that down on the coast, a number of other Spaniards have come from Cuba, and they're here to take Cortez and make him a prisoner. So he leaves the Central Plateau, he leaves the capital, takes a number of his people down to the coast to deal with this new collection of Spaniards who've come to take him and take away his control. And he leaves in the capital in control a very tough, vicious commander in Pedro de Alvarado. The Aztecs come and say, look, this is our big month for certain ceremonies in honor of our artistic expressions, our music, our male beauty, and we want to have this ceremony. And so, sure, go ahead, have the ceremony. So they have this ceremony, and the Spaniards surround the whole ceremonial precinct. And at the height of the ceremony, as you see here in a book that was painted in the several decades later, they rush in and dismember several hundred of these artists, dancers, and we have the eyewitness account by the Aztecs themselves of what happened that night. Now, this changes the Aztec position on the Spaniards 180 degrees, and they decide we're not negotiating with these people. We're not showing any more hospitality. Cortez hears about it, rushes back to the capital, and the war for the capital now really takes place. Even though he's got all these allies of the Tlaxcaltecans, they can't handle it. During this process, somehow Moctezuma is murdered. The Spaniards say that he was stoned to death by the Aztecs, who were disgusted with the fact that he'd been hospitable to the Spaniards. The Aztec version is, no, Cortez strangled him, garroted him, and threw him into the lake. This is something that further research still needs to be done. And what happens is this battle takes place, and the Aztecs, they run the Spaniards out and the Tlaxcaltecans. And here you see a recreation of this tremendous battle that takes place. I want to say early in 1521. And the Spaniards limp out, the Spaniards and the Tlaxcaltecans, they limp out of the city, and they make their way back to Tlaxcala, but they're on the run. The Aztecs are following them, ambushing them, killing them, and they lose a lot of people. The Tlaxcalans, they lose a lot of people. So what they do is, see if I can get my cursor here, they make their way, actually they go across the lake, and they make their way back to Tlaxcala. Now it's during this period, while they're in Tlaxcala, that two things take place. The Spaniards have left smallpox in the Aztec capital, and that smallpox spreads through the Aztec capital. And a number of the royal family are killed by this epidemic. And the population is weakened. The second thing that happens is while they're in Tlaxcala, they work with Tlaxcalan carpenters and they build 13 small ships, which they're going to use as part of the siege against this garden city. And with the Tlaxcalan Indians, these indigenous people, they carry these 13 boats down to the lakes. And when they arrive over here, they hear that there's been this smallpox epidemic, and it's weakened the population in the capital. It's killed several of the royal family. And what happens is Cortez then does an entire, he takes some of his people and they go all around the lakes and they start to build alliances with other groups that are against the Aztecs. And by the time they begin the siege of the capital, smallpox has swept through the capital, and many people are dying, not only weakening the warriors, weakening the rulers, but also weakening the general population. Here you see again these paintings of the impact of this disease. So what you then have is you have the war for the city. And this war that takes place has been painted in all kinds of different formats. And here you see, here's the capital back here. Here are the boats that have come in the lake. And there have been a number of paintings of this battle. Now, both the Spaniards and the eyewitness accounts among the Aztecs have described this. This is a horrific siege and battle. It's total chaos. The city smells so bad because of all the dead on both sides. But remember, Cortez has got 80% of his army are other indigenous warriors. And they know how to fight the Aztecs. And this battle takes place. Here's a wonderful painting by a Mexican painter named Camarena, showing the Aztec eagle warrior attacking the Spanish soldier on one of these horses. And you get here a sense of the energy and the danger of it all. So I'm coming closer to the end. Plague century. it wasn't just that epidemic that weakened Mexico. One of the great Franciscans who comes to Mexico soon after, his name is Toribio de Benavente, known as Motulinia. When the Franciscans came, they had vows of poverty. So the people named him Motulinia, the guy who's poor or afflicted. And he writes a book of what he saw and what he learned. It's called Motulinia's History of the Indians of New Spain. And in it, he describes the 10 plagues, borrowing from the Bible. And he says, man, the first plague was the plague of this disease. The second plague that hit the Indians, the indigenous people, was a great number of killings in the war for Mexico City. The third plague was a famine that came after they took over Mexico City. The fourth plague was the greedy overseers. The fifth plague was the taxes and tributes the Indians were forced to pay. The sixth plague was the fact that the Indians who died in the mines. The seventh plague was building the city of Mexico. They employed more people than it took to build Jerusalem. They were crushed by beams. They fell from heights. The eighth plague was the slaves the Spaniards put to work in the mines. The ninth plague was the service to the mines. What happened to the Indians? The 10th plague was the infighting among the Spaniards in Mexico. Here you see another document that's showing what happens in Mexico City later. In the 1540s, you had these plagues that would come through. And here you see people who have died of these plagues. In less than a century, the number of people living in Mexico fell from an estimated 20 million to 2 million. It's a massive population loss. Really, it's impressive. Says Rodolfo Acuña Soto, an epidemiologist at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. What can even kill so many people so quickly? He asks. Later, much later in the century, there's another passage from an indigenous man who still spoke the indigenous language, became an acolyte in the Catholic Church, learned how to write, wrote a number of books, and he writes down how these epidemics would come through, usually brought by Europeans, and how it devastated people. Here's an article. Those of you who might want to look at this. I'm having problems seeing a part of the but by Sarah Zhang. And just more recent research, they've been able to go into some of the cemeteries and look at the teeth and find out what they think caused some of these later plagues. In the decades after Cortez, we killed millions of this indigenous population. From morning to sunset, wrote a Franciscan friar, the priest did nothing but carry the dead bodies and throw them in the ditches. So this is my next to last part. So here you are, 1520, probably 20 million people, indigenous people, were living in Mexico. By 1600, it's less than 2. And these are the different epidemics that hit the Central Plateau during this time. Again, just imagine this in comparison to our worries, our tremendous worries with COVID. So the final plague that I want to talk about, I know I've talked a long time, what I call the racist plague. What happens is within the Spanish community, there's a tremendous argument going on between the conquistadors who said we were right to do everything we did, and a number of priests who say this is not Christianity. And a great debate is organized by the king that takes place in Valladolid, Spain. And they have 2 questions. What's the true nature of the Indians? Where do they fit on the great chain of beings? That are they humans? And the second big question in this debate is, can Europeans justifiably use violence, war, and conversion to convert Indians to Christianity? Now, whenever you have people getting around to ask questions about other people, are these people human? You know you're in trouble. Your culture is in trouble for raising the question, and those people you're talking about, they're going to be in trouble for a long time. This, in part, is one of the origins of racism in the Americas. Because on one side, of this argument, of this plague, you had the translator of Aristotle in Spain. He wrote a 550-page Socratic dialogue applying Aristotle's notion of natural slavery to the Indians. Aristotle's notion was, look, some people by nature are to be slaves. Some people by their nature, not because we beat them up, but by their nature, they're to be slaves. And these indigenous people and the Africans who came, that's them. They are by nature this way. He felt that Indians were natural slaves and all they could do was imitate Christians and not really become. But on the other side was this man, Las Casas. And Las Casas said, I've lived with him for 40 years and I can tell you this is a lot of nonsense. These people are rational, they're fully human. They compare well with ancient cultures in the old world. And in some way, I've seen them love their children. I've never seen people in the Mediterranean love their children the same way these people do. This becomes known as the Great Debate. And you can tell this debate is still going on. So finally, let me just tell you for one and a half minutes about what's called Day of the Dead in Mexico today. Mexico's been through so many of these kinds of population disasters. And here you see what's called Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, which we celebrate at Harvard in the Peabody Museum. And what's happened is Mexico has developed a whole aesthetic around this, a way of respecting the antepasados, people who have died, but also a kind of a sense of humor in the face of this, because after a while you cry so much, there's no more water. And here you see one of these floats on a big Day of the Dead going to Mexico City. He says, "Para Panteón, let's go to the cemetery." You have a giant, he's got this cross, but a skull on the back of it. And in Mexico, and here now more and more in the United States, as Mexicans and Latinos are embracing their own identities, you have these outdoor displays of Day of the Dead, where you always have the food that the dead liked, the soups, the pozoles, you have the drinks that they liked, you have this kind of sense of humor of looking at the dead, and in the cemeteries in Mexico still, during the Day of the Dead, people go there and they spend hours and hours, and they spend all night decorating the graves. They don't just go for a while and spend 20 minutes and so forth. No, they spend hours being with the people in the past. And Mexico has developed a very impressive sort of artistic way of responding to this tradition of suffering. And here you see during Day of the Dead, how people dress up. They have these promenades. They do all kinds of incredible artwork. Maybe some of you saw this in the beginning of one of the films, James Bond films. They make these huge puppets. They put a great deal of energy into this. They have these silent promenades in honor of the dead, and they have also these great dances. But you see, they're all dressed up like the spirits of the people who suffered this. And at Harvard, in the museum, we have a great offering there that I helped to curate. Just finally, in Mexico, in Juarez and El Paso, 2 years ago, there was this massacre that took place of Mexicans by a young white man who drove all the way from Dallas, and he went there just to kill the Mexicans. He killed 7 Mexicans, and the rest of them were Mexican Americans. And I wrote a piece about this called "Saying the Mexican Names." This was another epidemic of racism. And a woman in Appalachia was impressed with what I did, and she took 23 days, and she painted each day these portraits of the people who were killed in El Paso on the border. And she not only painted the portrait, she looked up their names, and she found the meaning of their names. Here's Raul, means wolf or counsel or wise. There's Maria Eugenia, who was killed in the Walmart by this young man who drove 10 hours. And this painter, she asked me to see if we could get these paintings sent to the families of the people who were killed. And I got in touch with my friends in El Paso. These were the youngest These were the youngest. This was a couple. Both of them died when they were trying to protect their infant child. And we were able to return, to send all of these paintings to the families. And I've received a number of very fine thank you notes. And so maybe it's a different kind of turning point. How different kinds of pandemics maybe didn't really conquer Mexico, but just gave it another reason to be creative and caring in its responses. So listen, thank you very much for sticking with this. I hope this was useful for you. I know I took longer than I should have, but thank you for listening.
Well, Profe, that was amazing and so in detail and devastating, and you ended on such a note of, sort of the perseverance of people, it's just amazing to see. And it's such an emotional presentation. We have a few questions, just sort of clarifying a bit about the specific plagues. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit, if you can, on the bacteria or virus. It's, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing it right. It sounds like coccolitsil. Is that a form of smallpox, or is that a different type of plague from smallpox?
I knew that these questions were going to come up from somebody there who has a biological background. And what I would like that person to do would be to write me an email. I didn't have a chance to review that. I think it is a form of smallpox. We have a scholar at Harvard who works on this, on the coccolitsil, and I'll be glad to answer that better than I can answer it now. Let me just tell people, if I'm a little bit off, I just had my second COVID shot yesterday, so I'm dealing with my but I'm here to do my best.
Oh God, you're amazing. Stop. And congratulations on getting that shot. I'm actually quite envious. Now, there are a few other questions related to the time. Do you have any speculation on whether or not these type of pandemics happen to the natives in North America? You mentioned Europeans bringing the plagues and the pandemics. Any thoughts on that?
I think there the data is just not as clear. So what happens in North America, first of all, is for the most part, at the time that the English, the Dutch come, you don't really have in that part of North America cities. People are much more spread out. You don't have the problem that you had in Tenochtitlan, which was a city where maybe 80, 100,000 people are living close together, therefore they can spread it. I think there is evidence of some epidemics that impacted Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's nearly as developed. And let me say something about this. Is a great question. There's been all kinds of arguments about the scale of the impact of these pandemics in Mexico. There have been some people who write articles, some scholars, saying that we just don't have enough clear evidence, and others have argued back and said, look, not only do we have clear evidence, let me show you the evidence. The great demographers Bora and years ago were the ones who made this claim about 90%. That's dropped some, but there's still clearly evidence of really a catastrophic in Mesoamerica. I'm not up on Peru, but I think that kinds of plagues that maybe pass through some indigenous communities in North America were not as devastating as what happened in central Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes complete sense. Now let's see. We have another question related to plagues and pandemic, but Ariel Gamino, a volunteer of ours in Texas, who's wonderful, asks that DNA studies have shown that perhaps salmonella was also a cause of many deaths. Can you comment on this?
Again, I'm not up on this, but I just saw a message there from someone talking about the Wampanoag, saying that there is evidence that there was a big reduction of numbers. And so I just want to give an echo to that particular statement. I've heard this argument about salmonella. I'll have to I'll have to respond in an email. I'll do a little bit more, update myself.
Okay, sounds good. Now, this one's interesting, playing the what if game. Is it reasonable to assume that without the plagues and smallpox that the Aztecs would have defeated the Spanish?
Maybe. That's a really good question. Of course, it wasn't just the Spanish. You have to remember that you've got this other kingdom, the Tlaxcalan kingdom. I think that's a very good question because it raises, the larger question: what were the many causes for this defeat? So one of them was the technology. What the Spaniards had, and not only these horses, they've got cannons, they've crossbows. They also fought to kill. Aztecs were not, when Aztecs fought, they fought to capture. They fought to wound and capture, and that caused a setback for them. There's a wonderful book written by Inga Clendenin called The Cost of Courage in Aztec Society. Courage was to, fight hand to hand and wound and capture, not so much to kill. Partly was you took captives back. That's where you got these riches. That's where your status went up. So I think that it's the Allies, it's the technology, and it's the epidemic. Those are three things that are really tough to overcome. Well, the other thing that they did was you see the lakes themselves, there's one freshwater lake and 4 saltwater lakes. What the Spaniards and the Tlaxcalans did is they destroyed the aqueduct that was bringing the fresh water to the city. And there's also accounts that people were just starved them out.
Wow. Do you think Christianity played a role during the plagues, that transformation to Christianity?
That's a good question too. I do think that. Christianity was adopted by many indigenous people, not primarily because it was the religion of the conqueror. Is a lot of it made sense to them because, for instance, anyone who goes to Mexico today knows the pervasive presence of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Virgin of Soledad, the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary has a loving message. And the indigenous people, they had many goddesses, many female deities that they loved and worshiped and served. As a matter of fact, the apparitions of the Virgin of Guadalupe outside of Tenochtitlan took place on the hill where indigenous deities, female deities, were also worshipped. The other thing that's very interesting, indigenous people who converted, they would maintain some of their beliefs and practices, and they together with what they're learning from the Catholics. And many of the males, they took the name Santiago. They like the name Santiago. So they might be Huitzilopochtli Santiago or something, because Santiago had that horse, and they love this sacred animals. So there's all kinds of reasons for indigenous people to take Christianity and then make it their own. I mean, the other person that I would recommend for your viewers to read is William B. Taylor. Wrote a tremendous book called Theater of a Thousand Wonders. And it talks about what he calls an American Christianity, an indigenous Catholicism. Indigenous people were able to pick and choose things from their own community, their own religion, and join them with things that they found meaningful and useful in their own worldview, the crisis that they were in. So I think that in terms of these, the woman who's taking care of the woman who's suffering, what you're going to do is you're going to go for what works. You're going to go for what works. And I think it was this combination that you see still in indigenous communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of, Sarah Rodman, hi Sarah, asked the Indigenous American village where the Pilgrims Plymouth, Massachusetts group settled in the 1600s had been emptied out and depopulated by a plague, also brought by earlier European explorers. Are these coincidental occurrences isolated by geography, or are there links to what took place in Mexico?
Well, so what takes place in Mexico, takes place much earlier. What takes place in Mexico, starts in 1517. The Spaniards don't really get ashore. They're not spreading. It's really 1520, 1519, 1520s. And through the 16th century, these things are happening. Some of those people, does that disease spread north? Yeah, it's quite possible it does. It's a long way from there to, it's a long way from there to Massachusetts.
Mhm.
But, people were on ships. And the point is that these diseases that came from Europe, they were so different. It's like COVID comes.
Mhm.
How are you going to build up immunity?
Mhm.
People, they had their own diseases. They didn't have those diseases, so they didn't have immunity for this. And so Europeans, one scholar says, what the Europeans brought was the lethal handshake, or they shake hands and or
Right.
the priests would actually, sometimes they didn't have baptismal water,
Mhm.
touch their tongue and put it on people's foreheads.
Oh, right. Okay, well, Vera asks, are there accounts of the indigenous people celebrating what we know now of Day of the Dead back in the 1500s when they suffered through these multiple pandemics?
So what we know is that, so what happens in the answer to that question is that the Franciscans come to Mexico right after Cortez and they set up a school. They always got these Indian schools. So this is a school where they want to learn what the indigenous people know. And so they start to train these Indian youth, the royal families survived, and they train them to speak Latin, Spanish, and Nahuatl. These students become trilingual. And students bring their uncles, their cousins, their fathers come, and they interview them. And in the interviews, what they find out is that they had a Day of the Dead ceremony before the Spaniards come. Spaniards bring All Saints Days, but indigenous people, they already had their ways of honoring the dead, feeding the dead, bringing the dead back in spiritual form. And this continues on in different ways all the way till today. I'm absolutely convinced of it. Yeah.
Great. Now, would you say that this situation was similar to the Mayan people?
It was similar to the Mayan people. The thing about the Mayan, with the great civilization of the Maya, which we celebrate, that really started to wane. If Professor Fash is here, he could tell us this. Really in the 8th and 9th century, there's still Maya civilization. There's still Maya ceremonial cities, and they also suffer from these pandemics. Absolutely. And because the Spaniards, they went down into the Maya region as well. They went down, into what is Guatemala and Honduras. Took some. They bought these little gifts of diseases too. So yeah.
Right. Thank you for sharing so much about your wonderful family. My gosh, what a rich history you have. A related question, Claire asks, do you think that the sign, "No dogs or Mexicans allowed," that was posted in the restaurant when you were a child would create a community moral uproar if it was posted today? And has anything changed since your childhood, would you say, regarding how Mexicans are considered, non-Mexicans in this country generally? Have you witnessed some change in the course of your lifetime?
Oh, I've witnessed a lot of change. Absolutely. There's been a lot of change, not enough change. A lot of change in terms of African American, in terms of Mexican Americans, in terms of women's. But it comes when people speak out. It comes when people speak out and speak up, when they organize. There's no question that there's been changes. But, the thing about, the reason I talked about the other plague, the racist plague.
Mhm.
You know, once you get people having big discussions by the leading theologians. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, whether Black people are human, whether women should have the right to vote, whether Mexicans are human. Once you get that in the water and people start drinking that, man, that tastes good to some people. Oh man, I want to, we build a wall and keep these people out. We're going to say terrible things about it. Once that gets circulating, it stimulates some people. Oh, they like that. And that's why you've got to have, democratic discussions so we can examine, like my grandfather, how to make what I call the new demography a better democracy.
Mm.
Yeah, there has been, but the other thing I'll tell you is, if you want to have hope, you've got to see it in the student body.
Mm.
And one thing that's wonderful about being at Harvard, and I teach also in the extension school, where I love the extension school students.
Many of them are on today and have been giving you shout outs in chat.
Oh no, they're tremendous. And they, first of all, one of the things that makes Harvard worth it is that there's a tremendous deep hunger for learning, new knowledge. And Harvard has a capacity to help organize new knowledge. Mm-hmm. And it's the hunger for new knowledge, for honest knowledge, for taking the silences and bringing the voices together. That's been expanding a whole lot since, my father and I drove across Texas. You could find that, you could find that that kind of sign in some places, but you're not going to find that sign in too many places.
Oh, well, that's reassuring. I mean, we are getting short on time here, but I just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and, enlightening us with this history and giving us so much to think about, really. It's incredible. Do you have any last words that you'd like to share before we sign off?
Well, I think that, what I want to share is that, a university is not only, the lifeblood of a university is not only its students and its faculty and its building, it's very much its alumni. Because the alumni are the proof of the pudding. The alums are the proof of what the university is. And I think that what really makes a great university is to have alums, on the campus, talking with students, professors, and keeping this alive. I like what Pablo Neruda said, that we have to be guided by our twin stars of struggle and hope. And hope means not just optimism. Hope means, working to discover knowledge that hasn't been known before. Mm. And I think that's what the alumni community is doing. And so I'm very grateful that you invited me to meet your people.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I can speak on behalf of them that they're very grateful that you spent your time with them and me today. It was just brilliant. And I agree with you. Our alumni community is wonderful, and all over the world. We're in over 180 countries, and our office seeks to support all of you, in your post-Harvard life. So there's lots of opportunity for many more discussions just like this. Great questions submitted as always, and we look forward to seeing you at an upcoming event. So please let our office know if there's anything that we can do for you in the meantime, and we hope to see you in person just as soon as we are safely able. And thank you, Prof. A, and thank you to the Midwest chapter for this wonderful idea, and be well, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Saul. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Tim.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Good night.